Excellent.
Hi.
Okay. Hello. So welcome to the fifth Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm very honoured to be speaking to Thomas Schorr Kon, who is the founder of Trackways. Trackways teaches a wide range of skills from basic bushcraft courses, wildcraft survival, tracking, nature connection and awareness, and the shamanic wilderness spirit work. Thomas has trained with the renowned medicine tracker Tom Brown Jr. over the past 20 years, and he returns regularly to his school to continue his training. Thomas was previously involved in teaching ancient English woodland crafts from 1992. He has also trained with Indigenous people and other medicine teachers. Through extensive personal training and research, he has developed a deep understanding for the full spectrum of skills associated with earth living. He is also trained as a martial artist since the age of 8. So welcome, Thomas, to this podcast. Really lovely to have you here.
Yeah, I'm touched and honoured to be here, Piers.
Thank you.
Appreciate having the opportunity to share, which is my joy.
Well, it's a real honour. So I first met Thomas in 2008. I went and did his survival course. I think it was a 4-day course. I think it was September time. Lovely weather, similar to here actually at the moment. And then we met again last year, and I just really loved that connection. We had a few conversations, and since I started the podcast, I'm like, yeah, I'd love to speak to Thomas, and because I've been reading his book recently, True Nature, I was like, oh yeah, I'd love to speak a bit more in depth. So some of the topics I'm really interested in talking about today, partly was about the magician, the shaman, partly about the warrior. You talk about the warrior quite a bit in the book, and yeah, so I have a few questions. Before we begin, I'd just like you to maybe share a little bit about your own journey, about what drew you into this work, Thomas.
That's a bit of a long story.
Okay.
So I'll try and keep that really brief. What's really interesting to me about that journey is that in the late 80s, I was at art school and really feeling the pain of the earth at that time, and feeling really powerless and disconnected, and living in the inner city. The only thing that was alive for me then was really my inner life and my capacity to express myself as an artist. And I didn't really have any, much nature connection. I hadn't been brought up in that way, per se. I'd been brought up in a town mostly. When I was very young, we'd lived in Wiltshire, on the Wiltshire, Somerset, Dorset border. And at the age of 3, 4, I was off running through the forest, and that really started that quality of connection with nature for me. Jumping in puddles as a kid. And my mother saying, "Why did you jump in there?" And me saying, "Well, it asked me to." That kind of delightful, sort of playful aspect. And that voice, I think that voice of nature never really left. Fast forward many years through some real difficulties, inner and exterior difficulties. So a friend of mine at college committed suicide, and this was a huge experience for me. I was in a resonant state with this friend and really had no skills to be able to help him. And he was having this sort of epiphany, this awakening, a kind of storming his way into heaven, and having, mostly through teaching plants, or drugs as people were calling them back then. The whole notion of teaching plants hadn't really made its way into our culture at that point. And he got sectioned and given even more powerful drugs and became sort of wooden. And then, I had no skills to be able to support and help this friend of mine. And I did my best, which was taking him out for a meal and trying to be a friend to him. And then his parents showed up and took him home and said, "Oh, we always thought you were crazy." And a month or two later, he took his own life. And this, for me, I was in a resonant state with him. So it sent me into a huge spin of feeling just unable to really do, I was writing my dissertation and felt in myself like I was at primary school. That sort of the wounded inner child in me was, the trauma of that experience had pushed me back into this state of feeling really helpless. Luckily, my parents sort of, both in their own ways, supported that. My father was a therapist and healer, and he gave me a number of healing sessions, one of which really brought me face to face with the sort of fulcrum of my difficult experience in life. And over the years, then after that, a few years, as I started to work with that fulcrum, I started to be able to transform my relationship to that emotional fulcrum. And what I've been finding in my shamanic work more recently is that if I can help somebody to find that fulcrum, then we can change the spell that fulcrum often is, and really shift that. It's like the fulcrum is the balancing point of that whole life in an emotional way. So this is one of the things that's been coming through recently in my work, is working with that kind of aspect. And it's through my own suffering and pain that I can see how useful that is. I then went back to college and completed my degree, but I made a promise that if ever a friend of mine got into a state like my friend who took his own life, that I would learn enough to be able to help somebody in that position. And that's what took me on the trajectory that I went on. Yes, there was this desire to connect with nature. I read a book. I said it was a long story. I read a book by Brian Bates, a fabulous book called The Way of Weird. And in it, there's this section where the shaman is with his acolyte and he makes fire by rubbing sticks together. And I was like, yeah, wow, I just need to know how to do that. And 10 years later, I found myself at the Tracker School with Tom Brown Jr. And this friend of mine, when I was living in Bristol, had said, "Oh, you need to find this book, The Tracker, and read it." And it took me a year to find it. And I found it and read it like that. Went back to the shop a few days later and bought every other book that he'd written, because I'd read Castaneda. And Castaneda talks about tracking and stalking, and he gets straight into the sort of spiritual aspect of that without, there are a few accounts of him tracking grouse or something in the undergrowth. And I was like, yeah, and how do you do that? I know how you do that. And then I started reading Tom Brown, and he's saying, yeah, this is how you do these practical aspects. So, and then I was reading his manuals, and I was running at the time, and I was living in Bristol, and I'd do these routes around that would take me just out of the inner city and onto the hills around. And one time I'm like, well, let's try this fox walking malarkey. And so I stopped running and I took 10 steps of fox walking with splatter vision, as he calls it in the book, which we now refer to as, peripheral vision or wide angle vision. And I met a fox head on. And I'd never seen a fox in all my, I don't know, that time, maybe 4 years of living in Bristol. And I took 10 steps fox walking and met a fox head on. And I was really like, wow, there's something happening here. And then another sort of tragedy occurred, really, which is that my father drowned in Australia. And, you know, this was a heartbreaking experience, but also a gift in a way, because each of, you know, my friend who took his own life, that made me make a promise. When my father died, I was like, shit, you can die at any time. There's no guarantee that we've got another day of life. So I better get busy with whatever it is that, you know, I'm supposed to be doing in this life. That was one of the things that I experienced when he died. And he'd always said to us, you know, follow your heart. So I was like, well, the only thing that I can do to honor him is to follow my heart. And the only thing I was feeling passionate about was these books that I'd been reading by this crazy guy in New Jersey called Tom Brown Jr., you know, who nobody had heard of in the UK at this point. You know, there were, I don't know, when I set up Trackways, there were literally a handful of schools in the UK, like 3 or 4, mostly run by, you know, ex-SAS officers, or, you know, people who'd been in the SAS and they weren't really not particularly happy to be doing it. You know, there were a couple of other instructors who are still going now, that I met right in the early days. And so then I went and trained with Tom Brown. And after 1 week of training, I felt like wherever I stood on the planet was my home. And this was a feeling that I'd wanted to feel since I was a child. And this is, for me, this is what all of us need, you know, not just as men, yes, as men, but also as humans. You know, the information of how to live on the planet, with the planet. Surely this is education, the primary education. And to see over the years that I've been training, you know, my premise when I started teaching was the more people who know this stuff, the more people there will be sharing it. And so I taught in a really open way, and I encouraged many other instructors to set up schools, and helped with the proliferation of this teaching in this country. I was the first person to teach the nature connection skills in the UK, and one of my students brought John Young over, you know, some years ago. And really the only person, well, I think there might be one other person who, or maybe two, who are teaching the full spectrum of skills that Tom teaches. The physical skills of survival, the nature connection, and the skills of working with spirit. And for me, these are integral, that I could feel the depth that existed in the physical skills. You know, making fire, changed my relationship to fire forever. You know, that first tinder bundle, 4 days it took me, you know, and then, wow, yeah, wow, you know, and then, you know, a fire lit in my heart, you know, and it's, I know how powerful a tool that is, you know, and I've used it to heal people, because it's such a powerful thing. And then, you know, fast forward another 10 years and I start to write that book, which took me 10 years to write. I'm working on my next book, and I wrote half of it in 6 weeks. And I realized that I'd learned how to write through writing that one. And so I come to write about fire, and I go back to Bateson's book about, you know, his book, The Way of Weird. And I find the bit about fire making, and I put this in the book because I read it and I'm like, how can you make fire like that? This is nonsense. This, you know, and I felt really, oh no, what had inspired me to want to make fire was complete nonsense. There was no way you could make fire in the way that was described in the book. And I was like, and then I thought, well, it lit something in my imagination. And then propelled me to actually go and do that and to learn how that was done, and then to want to share that with other people. So it can't have been that bad. You know, and so the sort of inspiration that it gave me was of huge value. Even though when I went back to read it, I would have put that into my book, you know, as a sort of mark of respect. And then I was like, but you can't do it like that. That's just a load of nonsense, you know. So there have been many moments like that on the way. So it's not so much about, you know, it's about the student and about the way, and not so much about, you know, the teacher. Teacher can't give you anything that you don't already have. Yes, you have everything that you need. All that a teacher can do is to point out some things. And my favorite story about that is that Tom Brown had been invited to go and teach away from his school in New Jersey. And he was waiting in the airport lounge with the student who'd invited him. And they're sat there waiting for the flight to be called. And he says, oh, can you hear that? And the student goes, what? He says, listen. The student starts to listen. And then he suddenly realizes that he can hear a cricket chirping in the airport lounge. And Tom says, where's it coming from? And the student gets up and he follows the sound, and he eventually ends up by this big planter. And there's a couple of crickets chirping in the planter. And he's like, and then he hears, you know, more further, and you can see that there are other planters. And then suddenly all he can hear are these crickets. And Tom motions him back. He says, yeah, come back. And he pulls a tiny coin out of his pocket and he throws it on the floor. And 20 people turn around because they can hear the sound of the coin hitting the floor. But nobody can hear the sound of the crickets. And this is all that a teacher can do. Oh, can you hear that? Oh, pay attention to this. Here, this is something interesting. You know, if we frame it this way round, then maybe you can make that workable. Yeah, so the workshop that I've been running recently this year started when I was teaching in India, is awaken the shaman you already are. Because it's clear to me that all of the facilities that we need to be a shaman are there. They're given to us at birth and through the process of us growing into becoming a man. But they get buried or forgotten, or we're told, oh, it's just imagination, or you know, don't have any dreams, and you know, don't think big, just think practical. You know, and we can come back to that. For me, the role of a teacher is sort of more of a guide.
Yeah.
You know, Tom Brown said to us, well, you know, you're going to learn way more from spirit than you are from me directly. You'll learn way more from nature directly than you will from me. And this is how it is. You know, my job as a teacher is to give you back to yourself as quickly as possible, not to hang on to you for years and years and years. Yes, my job is to try and help you to sort of recognize your facilities and put them to work so that you can make meaning for yourself, so that you can have a conversation with nature and spirit yourself without any intermediary. That's my job. And if I can accomplish that swiftly, then I'm a good teacher. And for me, I look at teachers and I go, you've got lots of students. How many teachers have you made? Or I look at a guru and I go, how many awakened people are there that you've assisted in that direction? That's the question, not how many people are following your path. How many people have you put on their path? For me, that's the question. And you know, I've been taught to a large degree in principles, and I'm fascinated with principles. And the beauty of principles is that you can go figure. If I tell you a principle of something, you can go figure. For example, practical principle with fire making is that the choice of woods that you want are that you want soft hardwoods and harder softwoods. So that gives you a band of choice of all the trees that you know, and you can then start telling me which woods are good.
Mm-hmm.
I could give you a list, and then that's all you have is that list. Or I could give you the principle, and then you can go figure.
Mm-hmm.
And so I prefer to try and teach in principles. It's a bit like that with healing plants. If I tell you the action of the plant, then you can choose how that's applied.
Mm-hmm.
If I tell you this plant is really good for a cold, I'm not telling you very much, and you're limited then to just using it in that way. It might be great for calming the stomach, getting rid of headaches, as well as good for a cold.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So my investigation is always into what are the principles that are acting here. And that's the same in the physical realm, as it is in the energetic realm, as it is in the spiritual realm. What are the principles? Because then I can start to really relate to my reality, or the reality that is going on, what's unfolding skillfully. And for me, that's a huge part of the way of the shaman and the warrior. It's not that I have to know everything. That's not important. And especially not pretending that I know everything. That's really unhelpful to my students. Yes, if somebody asks me a question I don't know the answer, then I'm like, yeah, great, that's homework for me. How cool is that? Stuff that I don't know, let's find out. Yes, not like, oh no, there's shame because I don't know something. No, I mean, so much to know. That's what's so wonderful, is that there's so many mysteries to solve, to uncover. And for me, it's about generating the excitement and curiosity to start with whatever, wherever you are. There's a whole load of mysteries right there. Where you are, sitting there watching this, there's a whole bunch of mysteries.
Thank you, Thomas. So what would you guide as a first step for people to begin, where we are at the moment, guiding into the mysteries? We have obviously access to the outdoors. What would you, if someone, I think most of the people who'll be watching this, mid 30s, 40s, 50s, men, women, who have done some work on themselves, what would you say would be a good step for them to start to connect to that mystery?
That's a lovely question. I like that question. And it's really the question that is the answer to that.
Okay.
And if we take the word question and we break it down, we get quest on.
Okay.
So when you ask a question, you're on a quest. I was lucky enough to be in the room when Tom Brown Jr. was asked. He said to us, look, okay, I've got a spare half an hour. Ask me anything. And luckily, there were a few skillful people in the room. And one of them said to him, what was the most important thing that grandfather taught you? And his answer to that was the sacred question. And the sacred question is something that is taught within the realms of tracking. And the sacred question is, what happened here? Or at least that's the first sacred question of tracking. And Tom went on to say, well, it's all very well me saying the sacred question, but what I learned from grandfather was to ask the sacred question 50 times a day. Awareness is the doorway to spirit. And awareness is powered by the quest I on, the quest that you are on. And then there's this weird paradox between asking questions and just being. You know, because we're like, well, you know, I've meditated for years and actually I don't really have any questions because I'm just being. Right? And that's one of the paradoxes that can happen in us in response to this notion of questioning. And it's like questions, it's not the sacred answer, it's the sacred question, which means that the answer isn't up to us. But when we ask a question, when we engage our curiosity, we get drawn into the present. It's like a guaranteed way of bringing us into the flow and into the present. And there's no end point. There's no end point to curiosity. Oh yeah, we get one answer, but it just spawns a whole load more questions. And the notion of, you know, awakening, enlightenment, and so on, and the whole purpose maybe of meditation is that there's this end point that's called enlightenment. And this is not, this doesn't relate to truth. There's no end point. There's just being more and more present and more awake in the moment. And what helps us with that is this sort of curiosity. Maybe it's our curiosity about that thought that just came in, or our curiosity about the feeling that is arising in us, or our curiosity about the particular plants that are pinging up at the moment, or that bird song, or that track, or why that person is wearing those particular clothes this morning, or why in the middle of our interaction with our woman, she's suddenly, this emotional thing has suddenly arisen, and we were on this sort of trajectory, this straight line of being a man and wanting to make love to her, and this emotional thing has come up, and we're like, no, that's just spoiling the mood, is maybe our response, rather than us going, oh wow, what is this? What is this aspect of intimacy that has come on the road that we're on to this destination? And then suddenly we're into this quality of connection with our woman because something has arisen, some trauma from the past. And maybe we're not taking it personally because we know that it's not to do with us, that we might have triggered it. But it's not something that, you know, that we have instigated in this other being. We might have triggered it in that moment because we're doing the same thing that a man did to her in the past, an unskillful man or an unaware man. You know, because a lot of the things that we do as men, we're doing unconsciously. And this quality of questioning, this is a natural form of inquiry. And, you know, we have meditation practice and we have inquiry. And this is left out of the picture often. And so the sacred question is a natural form of inquiry that is just curiously taking in what is arising. And hopefully we've started to understand one of the aspects of the way of the peaceful warrior that Dan Millman raises is that we've gone past this idea of good and bad. Because what happens is we have an experience and it's a good experience.
I was reading last night about that in your book about judgments.
Yeah, you know, it's like, oh, I met this woman and it's amazing and she's this and it's, oh no, and then she's gone off, it's with someone else and it's terrible and but you know what? On reflection, I learned some really important lessons. So is this good or bad? Well, it's neither. It's just really interesting. You know, this is, if you want something to do, run this as a program. It's not good or bad. It's just really interesting. And I quote Alan Watts' story, which you all know, about the Taoist farmer. And whenever I share this, I say, oh, you know this story about the Taoist farmer? And people look at me and look, no, I'm not quite sure. Oh, so there's this Taoist farmer and he has a horse, his horse runs off. And all the neighbors come around and say, oh, that's awful, your horse has run away. How are you going to take your goods to market? How are you going to plow the field? You know, he says, oh, we'll see. A couple of days later, the horse comes back, and it comes back with 3 other wild horses, and they corral them up. And the neighbors are like, wow, this is amazing. You've got more horses than the rest of us put together. We're jealous, you know. And then the farmer says, oh, we'll see. And then his son gets on one of the horses and tries to tame it and gets thrown off, and his leg gets broken. And the neighbors come around and they say, oh, this is awful. What bad luck. How terrible. And he says, oh, we'll see. And then the next week, an official comes to conscript all of the young men into the army. And his son has a broken leg. He can't be conscripted. And so it goes on. We don't know. We have no idea what is good and bad in that respect. So why do we keep judging everything like that? Oh, she's being emotional. That's a judgment. That's not being curious and paying attention to what's arising in the moment. It's not going, oh, wow, this is really interesting. What is it? What is this thing? And then we start to get into exploring this thing because there's safety, there's attention, there's holding of the space that as a man is part of what we're made of, what we're made for. You know, it's just being present and alive to what's happening with our heart intact, you know, with our heart whole, because we've taken that broken inner child and we've, you know, who was running the show and who may still be running the show and who is like invested in what is good and bad. You know, that, and the drama of that. And we are addicted to the drama of good and bad. Yeah. You know, we like it when it's going really well, and we like it when it's really bad. You know, other people's, you know, oh, it's so bad, oh, it's so awful, you know, and then we've got something to talk about.
How do we break this addiction to these judgments to the good and bad?
Nice question.
I'm deviating from the questions I put down. If you're okay with that, go with the flow. And
so, breaking this addiction it's not really an addiction. I think that's unkind to call it that. And I think that kindness is something that is really important. Because, you know, we can share what is true like a sledgehammer, or we can share it with kindness. And, you know, if I say that, everybody who's watching this is going to go, oh my God, I'm an emotional addict. And that's not what I'm meaning here. It's more that we're habituated towards this, that it's part of our habit to emotionally go up and down. And the cure to that is curiosity. Cure, I and us is in the word curious. So when we start to go, wow, this is really interesting, rather than deciding that it's good or bad, that's when we have an opportunity then to see it for what it is, whether it's something arising in us or around us. And the first time you try it, you'll most probably get caught up in the drama. Oh, and the second time, and maybe the third time, and maybe by the fourth time or the fifth time, you might start to be able to watch what's happening without getting so pulled into it, into one polarity or another. And the thing is that people don't like it when you're not invested in what's good and bad, because that's not normal, or that's not normal, but it is natural. It's natural not to be invested in that, but it's normal to be. So what happens is somebody comes to me and they say, I'm in the grip of this terrible ... And I go, wow, that's fantastic. You know what you're in the grip of. Right? Which is not the lines I'm supposed to utter.
Mm-hmm.
The lines that I'm supposed to utter, oh, how terrible, oh, how awful for you. But that's not going to help. That's going to reinforce that particular feeling, and it's not going to bring any clarity or any capacity to see what's happening, to feel what's happening, to know, to understand, to draw meaning from what's happening. And, you know, our capacity to read and understand things comes from the sacred question, what happened here? The second sacred question, what is this telling me? The third sacred question, what does this mean? And each of these questions addresses one of the different levels of being. And there are other levels than those, but the three levels that are most obvious to us, the physical, the energetic, and the spiritual. And one of the things that I have found particularly useful within the shamanic teachings that I've received from Tom Brown Jr. is the definition between the energetic and the spiritual. Most shamanic teachings lump that all together. Whereas in all of the major systems, there's a definition between energy and spirit, qi and shen in the Chinese system. Yes, there's a difference between prana, which is like qi, and the spiritual aspect, which I don't know the Sanskrit name for. But these are not separate but distinct aspects, and they're governed by slightly different principles. So just to come back to your question about, this is the emotional realm that we're talking about. And for the warrior is really interested and curious about their emotional realm. One of the things that I really love from Gurdjieff is what he calls park dog duty. You take the dog into the park and you sit on the bench and you watch it run around. And in order to change anything, in inverted commas, in us, we need to just do park dog duty, which is we sit on the bench and we watch it happening. And when we see it really clearly, just the one time, really clearly, then we're like, whoa, what am I doing? No, not like that. And then it can change. So we're not trying to change anything. We're just watching it really carefully. Sat on a park bench, watching the dog run around, watching the emotions at play, noticing what's happening in our mind or body.
I think you mentioned in your book, I mean, this idea of being relaxed, and I've studied Aikido for a few years, and in that idea of, being softer you are, and do you feel that kind of the principle of watching the dog? It's like in that relaxed space, because I feel we as men, as humans, we can be quite controlling, and being in that relaxed space that doing a practice like martial arts kind of cultivates. Do you feel that that kind of brings that into this this softness?
Yeah, I love talking about softness, because it's I think it's really maligned, and in relation to martial arts, I think there are certain things that really have to be said. And that is that they're a somatic practice. So I think it took me until I was about 50 to realize how defensive I was, because I was practicing self-defense. As a physical martial art, the somatic effect of that was that I would defend myself. And I started to understand that within the emotional realm, defense is a form of attack, because it's stopping anybody from really seeing into me. And then I started to practice a form called water form, which is really wonderfully unknown. And yet it's the softest form I've come across, softer than Tai Chi and Aikido. And my somatic experience started to change. And I started to find myself able, so the overriding principle of water form is yielding in order to advance. So what this means is that there's a yield that allows advancement, that creates more space than anybody thinks is there. And then this leads us, as we start to find that emotional softness, to make more space. And one of the ways that that can happen is that we accept the blame. The Buddhists have this concept of rolling all blames into one, which means that we just take the blame for everything. The thing is that when you take the blame, you have the responsibility. And if you have the responsibility, you have the power. Oh, well, if I'm the one that's causing you to feel that, then that's within my power. And people don't like having their power taken from them. So when you start to take the blame, you go, oh, yes, okay, I'm sorry, it was my fault. And you're sort of holding that space. Then they start to feel a bit uncomfortable and they go, well, maybe that was my thing. Maybe there's enough space then that you can hold for them to take that back, to actually recognize what it was that was theirs within that. And so that's a yield in order to create advancement.
I can feel that in my heart,
we like to be right. And I've given it up because all it ever does is causes arguments. So I don't mind being completely wrong. And, what I have to say at this point is don't believe a word I tell you, because that's just lazy. Run your own experiments and rest on the results that you have from those. Now, that is the path of the shaman. That statement is the path of the shaman.
So can you say that again, please?
Don't
Thomas?
believe a word I tell you, because that's just lazy. Run your own experiments and rely on your experiments. Then you're on the path of knowledge.
Beautiful.
Because any belief that you hold is between you and the truth. So when you stop believing everything and you start to run your own experiments, then you start to be able to know what's happening. So the questioning starts to help you to develop understanding. But to feel something is to know it. So the questioning brings you into this place of, well, if he's saying that that's the case, then let me just run an experiment to check that. That's research. That's the search part. Then we get into, the park dog duty is observation, is our capacity to observe ourselves and others. And these are all crucial elements, if you like. And then we get into this, this running our own experiments and not, we might resonate with something. So I am hoping that the people that are watching this are resonating with some of the things that I'm saying. But that doesn't mean that they're true. It's like then you run your own experiments to verify whatever it is that someone else has said. So I've given a couple of experiments, for people to try. And maybe you're not used to running experiments. I run them all the time. If I haven't got a question running, then there's no kind of life, no energy there.
What's one of your questions you've got running at the moment, Thomas?
The problem with me answering that is that might take me like 20 minutes to answer.
No problem.
And you might not actually, you might or might not have a similar experience of the things that I'm talking about. So I'm one of the things that I'm particularly curious about at the moment is I have a physical body. I have an energy body also, and a spirit body, and then have another divine body as well. And a lot of my questioning and experiments at the moment are around how they work and interact, and how the energy moves from one to another, and what happens when that changes. Just to give you an idea, I mean, those are some of the experiments that I'm running personally.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful. Do you find, because I've been reading recently, similar thing, asking questions throughout the day to ask these questions. Do you find that therefore you are asking the question about those 4 energy bodies, or about so you're consciously...
I'm in the stage of running experiments. So certain things Spirit has given me, certain things I've had an experience where I'm going, oh, this information, oh, that's really interesting. For example, you have a particular flow that's talked about called the Microcosmic Orbit, which I've been using for a long time, which is a way of using the sexual energy and drawing it up the spine and down the front of the body. And these are aspects really of alchemy that relate to the sacred masculine, where we're starting to use our sexual energy to integrate that into our being. And what happens as that energy, that charge builds in our system? What do we do with that charge as men? Mostly our society is, sorry, it's a rhetorical question.
Oh, okay.
But you can go for it.
Well, for me, it's dissipate. We dissipate that energy. Exactly.
And our whole society is designed to help us to sort of wank that energy away, to dissipate that energy. But what happens is that when we start to circulate that energy through our system and build that energy, then our physical vitality changes. Our spiritual energy starts to build, because we can then take that into not just around our physical and energetic system, but we can then start to circulate that around our spiritual body. And that starts to have the aspect of creating way more resilience in us than is possible at a physical or energetic level. And then, the divine body and so on, which again, I haven't yet come across any accounts of some of the things that I'm practicing. Some of them I have. Yes, some of them I have. Because for me, the energy, what Spirit showed me was that the energy is not just moving in this circle, it's also crossing over through all of the energy centers like a caduceus. That's what I was shown, and that the energy moves up through the body in a rainbow. Each of the centers having this rainbow color, different, red to purple, through the physical aspect of the body and the crown. And so this is a bit more complicated to imagine than just circulating as one color of energy around the system, around your system, especially when you're feeling sexually charged. Yes, or you're sexually charged with a partner and you're working with these energies. And how your energy centers meet each other. So then you're with a partner and you can feel their heart energy meeting your heart energy. Or you can feel your sexual energy meeting their sexual energy center. And you can make love without either touching each other. Because you can feel this energy happening through the body. This is at an energetic level. These are some of the experiments that I'm working with at the moment. So I'm not really interested, I'm interested in the theory and trying to figure it out from my experiments.
It feels, as you speak, it kind of reminds me as a child that I used to like to make things or do things, make experiments. That was, for me, how I learned. And I see that as men, we've become very cerebral, we're on our computers, but we're not getting physical, we're not making things or making experiments, whether they be more mental but physical. Would you like to speak to that a bit? Because obviously on your courses you're often making things. Like when I did your course, we did spoons, we were kind of making shelters. Do you find as men that this is something we're lacking and something it'd be good for us to bring into more our lives? Making things, being physical.
Well, you just have to look around you where you're sat, and even at the computer that you're sat at. These are things that have been made mostly by men. We're surrounded by that, and yet we feel purposeless as men. And yet this is part of our ancestral connection. You make fire by rubbing sticks together. You can feel the ancestors there. You start chipping away at a piece of flint in order to make it into a knife. They hear that sound. They're like, oh, yeah, we remember that. And they'll come and sit with you. And then you've got this computer in front of you or your phone. I mean, how many ancestor power is that? It's not gone anywhere. This is the thing. We sort of think that the ancestors went a long way when they passed. They didn't go very far. The ancestors and our relationship to the ancestors, as we connect with the making of things, then there's a connection that we're making with our ancient ancestors. And they're, when they see the things that we've come up with, they're bewildered.
Yeah.
And yet, if you think about, so the first computer was based on these cards that were used to make weaving looms weave particular patterns without people having to do it. That was really the beginning of the computer, was a weaving loom. And it's sort of like we're not really interested in where things have come from. I'm fascinated with where things have come from. The same with words and sort of dismantling them and then repurposing them, because words are what we use, they're spells. My spelling is rubbish, but my capacity to make spells and speak in ways that empower others and myself, that I can do. And where a word comes from, fascinating to me. Part of my curiosity with I'm using these words, I'm interested in words, but I'm also interested in where things have come from. And I came across a really interesting notion of the beginning of culture. And the beginning of culture comes from a broken leg. One human taking their time to help another human's leg heal. The beginning of culture. So that means that healing is one of the most potent and important aspects of our culture. And what I find is that as I teach people these ancient skills, they go, what's the point of that in the modern world? And then they end up, in their hands, they end up with the seeds of culture. And they can't help but become teachers. Because somebody says, what, you mean you know how to rub sticks together and make a fire? Or you know about the medicinal plant uses? I feel lost because I don't know where I can find food and medicine. Help me feel found. Help me feel at home here on my earth by teaching me that. And it's like that's what I find my students go away with. That's one of the things that they take away, are these seeds of our culture. This understanding of how when you do a survival quest, when you strip everything away, and you're there for 4 days on the earth with maybe a couple of things, a knife, a blanket, container, and I prefer you to have made all of those things. But I'll let you bring those things if you haven't made them. And then you're starting from scratch. So you have to know what is important culturally for a human. And, the sacred order of survival is one of the things that we teach. Shelter, water, fire, food. But I don't just say it like that when I'm teaching it. I say, hey, what is the most important thing? Mm-hmm. Put yourself into each different type of environment and figure out what's going to kill you first. Then you'll come up with the same order that I've just told you. Really cold environment, really hot environment, temperate environment. You'll get to the same sequence. Mm-hmm. And if you know that sequence, you have 50% more chance of surviving in the wilderness situation. Bingo, just there, with that information, because you have purpose. You know what to do. If you don't know what to do, like here we are in this situation, does anybody really know what to do? No. But the first thing that started to happen is that we started to feel that we're all connected. Oh, thank goodness for that. Thank goodness that everybody's waking up to how connected we all are with each other and with this earth. This is a teaching that's really hard to teach because of our individual notions of ourselves. Our whole society is geared towards atomization of the individual. And here, this beautiful little virus taught everybody very quickly how connected we all are. Oh, and then the next thing that it started to create as a thought process is what we value. So something is happening here, it's like, what is happening here? Oh, yes, that's one of the sacred questions, isn't it? What happened here? What is this telling me? What does this mean? So when we have the capacity to extract meaning from experience, oh, and do you know where most cultures instill that in their young people? Is they have a rite of passage.
I was going to ask you about that because it's something that fascinates me, and you talk about it in your book. I'm aware of time now. I think we've been going for an hour, but please, if you'd like to speak about Rite of Passage for a bit, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So the elders weren't stupid. Right. You get a bunch of teenagers, they're all kicking off. They're all like, yeah, why should we be doing that? The elders like, oh yes, we have this ancient ritual. We take you off into the wilderness and we leave you the fuck alone 4 days away from everyone else so you can't piss us off, right? And maybe you'll learn something. Obviously, there's a priming that's required. There's a quest, a questioning. That's taking the young men to their edge. Oh, where's the edge now for us? Where is our edge? There's their inner edges, their exterior edges. Where's the edge? Because we need to go to the edge as men. We're too busy sat in the middle of the village, growing fat and stupid you know, not paying attention to where we might learn something. And so the quest, the Rite of Passage, is about maybe nature starts to speak to us, maybe spirit starts to speak to us, maybe we just learn one thing. Maybe at the point where we're so frustrated with having been left there by the elders, and we're like, what the F was this all about? And then we go, actually, you know what? Wow, it's really quite beautiful here. Whoa, look at that. And we start to suddenly be present for the first time in our lives. And that's when the elder shows up to say, oh, it's time to come back now. And we're like, no, I don't want to come back. I've just got here. Right? I've had that experience with a young man on his Rite of Passage. And that's what he shared. It was the most beautiful thing. It brought tears to my eyes. It brought a sense of warmth to my heart because he'd arrived there just when we turned up to bring him back. But he'd learned something. He'd learned something really beautiful and important. And in the mechanism of the elders then reflecting back to the young people, their journey, with tears streaming down their cheeks, with laughter and joy, you know, with sadness and heartbreak, and showing the young people that all of these things are part of what it takes to become a man. That we can't become a man without having a broken heart, without being able to laugh in the face of danger and destruction, without being vulnerable enough to shed a tear at the beauty that is continuously around us. You know, that's how disconnected we've become from ourselves and from this incredible experience of being a human, being a man or a woman. And yet, you know, and then there's all this grief that we carry, and what do we do with that? Well, we feel it. It's alive in us every day. As much as there is rapture alive in us, there's as much rapture and grief in us, the same amount. Otherwise, we get heavy with grief, or we become inflated with rapture.
It's interesting. I was interviewing Rod Boothroyd about a month ago, who wrote the book about the archetypes, the mature masculine archetypes. He's saying that in order for us to move into the king and feel into our joy, then we have to go through grief. We have to, you know, cry the tears and let that go. So I kind of, that sovereign energy.
And the thing is that the tears of rapture and grief are the same. They're not any different.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And that's the warrior's heart that you're talking about there, is the balance of grief and rapture simultaneously, not one or other. We're so busy with one or other. No, both simultaneously. Like there's a tear about to fall at any moment from your eye because you're feeling everything. And you know that it's going to pass. It's that quality. This is the quality of the warrior's heart. And to get onto the path of the warrior, we just have to take fear as our greatest teacher.
So those areas where we're frightened, we go there and go, you know, so for me, doing these podcasts, you know, facing my fear, in invitation to men to face what they're frightened of, to work out what it is.
So it's more, so I think that a better way to talk about it, or a way to talk about it that's really useful, is just to, whenever fear shows up, then we say, hey, What have you come to teach me this time? The so-called negative hates that. But the thing is that its purpose is for us to learn from it. But that's the last thing on its agenda. So that means that, I'll tell you just a quick story. I have a friend who uses the medicine, and she said to me, oh, every time I'm taking the medicine at the moment, the devil shows up and it scares the shit out of me. I said, oh, have you asked him what he's come to teach you? And she looked at me like I was a bit simple because of the level of fear that she was experiencing. I said, oh, give it a try, run an experiment. I met her a couple of weeks later. She said, took the medicine, the devil showed up. I asked him what he'd come to teach me. He was gone. I'm like, yeah, like that. Because it's that creating a situation where if that so-called negative aspect, and it doesn't have to be fear, I choose fear because fear is one of the meanest and nastiest demons in the yard. So I want to know how that works. That's what a warrior's interested in, is they scan the playground of demons and they go, you're the meanest and ugliest. You're there in everything. You're screwing everything up for me. So this is what puts us on the path of the warrior, is taking fear as one of our greatest teachers. And if we start to get the hang of, whoa, what have you come to teach me this time? Oh, now this is a question, right? This is a skillful question. If we get the hang of that, then any so-called negative aspect that shows up, we're like, what have you come to teach me this time? What's the lesson here? Then these things show up and we're like, yeah, it's okay, you can show up because you're going to show me something. And then it doesn't matter. Then we overcome this whole notion of darkness and light. You know, some angel turns up, we're like, oh, how lovely, wonderful. Let me just remain in impeccability around you. And this is how we develop impeccability with the so-called negative. And I call it the so-called negative because these are some of the best teachers. And they are going to visit everybody. I don't care who you are, and they're going to keep visiting until you've learned something. And so if you've been shown how to make meaning from experience in a rite of passage, then these things happen throughout your life and you start to be able to make meaning from that. You don't have to repeat that again and again and again when you've suffered consciously. You suffer unconsciously, you're going to repeat it many, many times. And it starts off like a butterfly landing on you. Then it's a sledgehammer that you drop on your foot. And then it's a double-decker bus. So try and learn from the butterfly, is my advice. And that comes through this making me, and there's this whole spectrum of meaning. Yes, my friend who committed suicide, he was at the end of the spectrum where everything meant something. And it's overwhelming. And this is what's called mental illness. Everything is meanings, everything is speaking to you. And everything means something. And you can't move for meaning. And it's as painful as the other end of the spectrum where nothing means anything. And you might as well not really be, you're not alive, you're the living dead, because nothing has any meaning. And the way of the shaman is about helping you to move into a position on that spectrum of meaning where you can make meaning that is really works and is useful for you throughout your life. And it's not that you're making something up. Yes, when I say making meaning, it's not that you're making something up, you're extrapolating information and turning it into understanding that then gives you the capacity to run some experiments to translate that into feeling so that you can know something. Something like that. But that's where the warrior and the shaman meet. There are places where they meet. And what I've tried to describe there is at the warrior's end of things, you have good and bad and the notion of judgment and it becoming interesting. At the shaman end of it, you have darkness and light and understanding that you're both and that they're not separate. And it's just a question of your relationship to darkness and your relationship to light, if you like. But so they're two things that are very similar, and yet one is in the realm of the warrior, and the other is in the realm of the shaman.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of those aspects creates a quality of unity and oneness in the person who has internalized that at a different level. So the internalization of the aspect of judgment is happening in the mind and body. So it kills the drama. We're no longer caught in the victim, perpetrator, savior triangle. It's just gone. You know, if you come as a savior, you're going to be crucified, people. So give it up. You don't need to, everybody's got what they need. They just might not quite know how it works. So you might need to just help them figure out how that works. Or, reorientate something here or there. Find a fulcrum or whatever it is. And then within the aspect of darkness and light, we're talking about the coming into a state of spiritual oneness. And, there are different levels of oneness, and I could have talked for an hour about that.
I think we probably could speak for another few hours. I have lots of questions from what you've spoken about, but I'm aware that I have another meeting in about half an hour, so I'll need to start tying it together. How do people learn more about you, Thomas? Where do they go?
Okay, so I have a website called Trackways.co.uk. You can email me at info@trackways.co.uk. My name, as it's written down at the bottom of the screen, I can't figure out how to point at it. You can see it there. If you key that in and the name True Nature to Google, you'll get my book.
Yes,
Working
recommend it.
Working on a second book as well, which I'm hoping will be out sometime this year.
Right.
And then there's a third book. I realized that True Nature is really about 3 books, and I'm sort of taking that and forming it into something sort of so that different mind states can understand what I'm talking about. True Nature sort of has got everything in there.
It's brilliant. I really like it. It's it's got the tracking, it's got the food. Yeah, it's really beautiful.
It's an attempt to try and create a context for the physical, energetic and spiritual skills, and to see how they all kind of fit together, and they usher you towards you really coming into contact with your true nature. That's really kind of what that book is about.
Beautiful. I hadn't kind of got that, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that's kind of what I'm attempting to do there. And talking about anything real, we can fail well in our attempt to talk about the truth So hopefully I'm failing well in my capacity to speak about the things that can't be spoken about.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Thomas. It's really been an honor speaking to you. And yeah, I've made lots of notes, and I will put a link in the bottom of the video for Thomas's book and to his website as well, and to his email address. So please reach out to Thomas. Yeah, please pick up his book. It's really great. It's got loads of really practical things, tools, teachings in there. So please get his book. And yeah, any last thoughts, Thomas?
Well, maybe a final question, really. What is it that stops you from resting in your heart? If you can answer that, or even if you have the courage to ask it of yourself, there's a worthy quest.
Beautiful. What is it that stops you resting in your heart? Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Lovely speaking to you, Piers.
Yeah, and I'll press the end of the recording, but we can just tidy up after that's finished. Okay. So, but thank you everybody for a really amazing podcast, and please feel free to comment below, and I'm happy to answer any questions or pass them on to Thomas. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye for now.
Bye.